I thought that it would be fun to talk about Andy Warhol and the Andy Warhol Museum. I was the chief curator at the museum for 2 years and director for 6 years, and I thought I would call the talk Consumption Times Production. The idea of Andy Warhol as a major consumer of culture, of objects, and an even bigger producer of artwork. And of course, we know Andy Warhol to be one of the most famous artists of the 20th century, who really defined not only American aesthetics through his pop art movement, but ultimately around the world, to the point that almost anyone can look at most Andy Warhol works and instantly identify with what they see, because he always used very common objects from everyday society so that everyone would ultimately feel comfortable looking at his artwork, and thus making his artwork very accessible and able to be easily understood. So I always start with a great photograph of Andy there at the age of 3 with his mother Julia and his brother John. Andy was born in 1928, August 6th, 1928, in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, and as many of you know, was the child of immigrants from Eastern Europe, from current-day Slovakia, to be specific. But his parents, Julia and Andrei, come from a very, very small village called Mikova in Slovakia, just about 10 kilometers away from the Polish border and about 50 kilometers away from the Ukrainian border. And of course, his father decided to move to America, to Pittsburgh specifically, to find work. Because of course, Pittsburgh in the early 20th century was one of the hubs of industrial production in America. Steel, tin, bronze, aluminum. There were a lot of factories, and in many ways, Pittsburgh was building the infrastructure of America at the time. And his father, Andre, decided to go there in order to find work. So he went first in the 19-teens and left his poor wife, Julia, back at home in Mikova for almost 8 years, and eventually sent for her so that she would come to Pittsburgh to be with him. And as soon as she got there, they started to have their children. They ultimately had 3 boys, Paul, the oldest son, John, the middle son, and Andy, the baby, born in 1928. It's important to know that the Warhol family, the original family name, Andy dropped the A at one point to make his name sound less ethnic, to make it seem a little bit more American. But the family was incredibly poor, so it was a real struggle for them to survive, and Andre had a job as a laborer, but had a very, very low salary. So the family was constantly struggling. And I always think it's incredibly amazing that someone that would go on to be the most famous person really in the world in so many ways comes from such humble background, but at the same time, because of that, he learned that hard work and dedication is incredibly important in order to succeed in life. Now, I always think about the collection of the Andy Warhol Museum, and today we're talking about museums and how museums ultimately change a place. The Andy Warhol Museum opened, so you know, in 1994 in Pittsburgh, which was very interesting in that most people would assume that the Andy Warhol Museum would be located in New York City, because Andy, of course, moved to New York City right after college, and that's where he built his career, he built his fame, and he made his artwork. Well, when Andy died in 1987, quite young at the age of 58, no one really imagined that he would, A, die that early, and B, that his reputation might be a little bit shaky at the time. But in the 1980s, Andy's work was pretty ridiculed by the art establishment. And when the trustees of his estate offered to partner with the Museum of Modern Art first to create an Andy Warhol Museum, MoMA, the most famous modern and contemporary museum in America, said no. They didn't think that Andy's reputation was strong enough. So the trustees of his estate approached Pittsburgh and the Carnegie Museum of Art and asked if they would think about opening a Warhol Museum in his hometown of Pittsburgh. Luckily, they said yes. And it happened in an incredibly fast fashion. So the museum opened in 1994, only 7 years after Andy's death. The museum has the biggest collection of Warhol's work in the world, with almost 900 paintings, thousands of prints, thousands of photographs, sculptures, all of his time capsules, and documents, records that he kept, which are over 500,000 objects held in 610 cardboard boxes. It's a huge research center for all things Warhol, and this is, I think, one of the most important objects that the museum holds in its collection, which when you look at it might not seem like anything horribly special, except for the fact that I believe this is the Codex of Andy Warhol, the very early, most inspiring thing that Andy owned, and this is his child book celebrity photograph album. And at around the age of 9, Andy started going to see movies whenever he could. He fell completely in love with Hollywood cinema, and it was the way that he fantasized about a world beyond his very humble reality. He thought, how can I be rich and famous like these movie stars? And he somehow convinced his brother Paul to write letters to the Hollywood movie studios to ask for autographed photographs of their celebrities from various films. So in the upper right-hand corner, you see Carmen Miranda. Below her on the right is Mae West, Henry Fonda next to her. He had dozens of these photographs, many of which are signed to Andy, love Carmen Miranda, or love Shirley Temple. So this becomes his personal fantasy photo album. And as you can see, he arranged them very carefully in the album in a perfect grid. Later, when he was making his artwork, Andy was known for the repetition and multiplication of the same image. And when he made his own celebrity portraits as paintings in the 70s and 80s, would often do them in grids of 4 or 8. So he's really somehow thinking about arrangement of celebrities at a very young age, and it's something that he would obviously run with. But this object, I think, more than anything, foreshadows who Andy Warhol would become, simply because he realized that because of all of these celebrities' talent, that they somehow became world famous, which is what he wanted really more than anything. And of course, in any museum context, it's the job of the museum to take care of these objects and these archival materials so that future generations will be able to access them and view them and use them as research materials. And that was one of my great joys, being at the Warhol Museum, so that I could share these really special objects with the world. This is another very rare drawing, and you wouldn't look at it and immediately think that this is Andy Warhol. This was made between Andy's first year and second year in college. He went to Carnegie Tech, which is today called Carnegie Mellon University in Pittsburgh. It's incredibly famous today for its technology programs, software engineering, robotics, and is really one of the best schools in the United States for anything dealing with technology. But at the time, it also had an incredibly strong art program. And Andy, you would think, would be a star student from the very, very beginning. But in actuality, after his first year of college, Andy's professors absolutely hated his drawing style. They decided that he wasn't very good. He had a very rough, broken line in his native drawing style. And they actually threatened him with expulsion if he didn't get better. So they gave him an assignment and said, you have to really hone your drawing skills or you're not coming back. And they said, you have to do life drawing. You have to go out into the world and observe and draw what you see. So this is one of the drawings that Andy brought back at the end of that summer, and it features his brother Paul's fruit and vegetable truck, because that was Paul's job, driving around the neighborhoods of Pittsburgh, selling fruits and vegetables to housewives so that they could cook. And Andy would stand off to the side and sketch. And as you can see, they're very sophisticated, incredibly complex. there's a suite of about a dozen of these drawings that are all in the museum collection. And you can somewhat see their undergarments. So the central figure, you can see her underwear through her dress. So Andy's being a little bit funny, showing what lies beneath. But when he brought these drawings back to his professors and presented them, they absolutely fell in love with his drawing style because Andy was always very smart. He was very good at marketing and branding and pleasing an audience. So instead of doing it in his own style, Andy completely mimicked the drawing style of his professors, almost perfectly. So they had no choice but to say, congratulations, these are fantastic. And he actually won a scholarship and was able to stay in school. And then very quickly became the star student. But it's always so great for visitors to the Warhol Museum to see these very early drawings. And I have to be very honest in that many people in first coming to the Warhol Museum are somewhat dismissive and say, well, how hard is it to paint Campbell's Soup? Or how hard is it to paint Marilyn Monroe? In fact, Andy's silkscreening technology and tactics were quite complex. But when they see these early drawings and the early works, they realize just how incredibly talented he was. So just a little bit more about Andy. In 1949, he graduates from college. And by this point, he's decided he wants to become a commercial illustrator, to use his drawings and his imagery to help promote products. So, of course, he realized that he couldn't do that in Pittsburgh and had to move to New York City. So within about 2 weeks of graduating from college, he picked up and moved to New York. This is a great photograph of him from 1950 called Making the Rounds, walking around town. And as you can see, he has his portfolio under his arm. And Andy was not shy at all and would go to fashion houses, department stores, fashion magazines, and asked to see either the creative director or the editor, and would show these people his drawings. And he was very famous for doing butterflies and cakes and shoes and really beautiful, whimsical drawings like these beautiful shoes from around 1955. And he just had a really fun way of presenting objects to the world. He also had a little trick, again, reminding you that he was very good at marketing and branding. He would oftentimes do a handmade book featuring some of these drawings, and he would give that as a gift to the editor or the art director of the place that he went to see. And that way they had something to remember, and they had an object. So they were always connecting Andy with this object, and then they would say, oh, maybe we should call Andy Warhol to illustrate this article that we're doing. So it's rather interesting and impossible, but Andy secured his very first job within 48 hours of landing in New York. And he went to see the fashion editor of Glamour magazine, a very famous American women's fashion magazine. And he left his portfolio, and the secretary at the office said, come pick it up the next day. So when he came to pick it up the next day, Tina Fredericks, who was the editor, asked to see him. And she said, Andy, I love your drawings, I'm hiring you. And that very first article that he illustrated was called Success is a Job in New York. And it featured illustrations of women in very nice suits climbing a corporate ladder to success. And it was very interesting that that's where Andy started, helping to support women in their careers, a very early feminist gesture in many ways, but it was also very foreshadowing about his own success, because very quickly, because of these sorts of drawings and this absolutely luscious cake, and you can see not only does it have fruits and frosting on the top, but it also has butterflies covering the entire cake. But because of this very whimsical, fun aesthetic, Andy was hired again and again. So by the end of the 1950s, Andy had worked for every department store, every fashion magazine, every mainstream magazine. He worked for Bergdorf Goodman, for Tiffany and Company, many big names that are still around today, and became quite successful, both in terms of critical praise in the commercial world. He won basically every prize within that industry. Artist of the Year, Designer of the Year, but he also became quite successful financially. And for him, as a poor kid from Pittsburgh, to actually have money was a really new concept for him. But he did so well that he actually bought his first townhouse in New York in 1960. So he was only 32 years old. And he bought it for the price of $60,000 US dollars. That house recently sold for about $4 million to compare the increase in price. But he paid half of that in cash, $30,000 cash, showing that he was doing really, really well as a commercial artist. But he wanted more. He really wanted to become a world-famous fine artist. And even though most Americans would have been familiar with his illustrations, they probably weren't familiar with his name, because commercial illustrators just aren't really household famous names. But he wanted that. He wanted to be famous like Picasso, or artists just a few years older than him like Jackson Pollock, the abstract expressionist painters. And that's what he really sought to do. So he started to experiment and think about other options, and this is another great treasure that we have at the Warhol Museum. Of course, you all know that Warhol became famous first in 1962 for the presentation of his Campbell's soup cans, painting all 32 flavors of soup that Campbell's made in that year. However, what you see here is a drawing from 1953, 9 years earlier, called Two Campbell's Soup Cans and Two Cats. This is not by Andy Warhol. This is by his mother, Julia, because Julia happened to be an artist as well. And she loved to draw. She drew constantly, and her favorite subject were cats and angels. And she had an incredibly beautiful writing, calligraphic style of her writing, and you can see that here. And I should say at this point that Julia was a very important factor in Andy's life. We can safely say that he was a mama's boy. He was with her constantly. In 1951, just about 2 years after Andy moved to New York, she was fully convinced that her young son could not take care of himself, and moved to New York City and moved in with him. So they became roommates, and they shared a very humble apartment at first, literally just sleeping on mattresses on the floor, until later when the townhouse was purchased. But they became collaborators. Because of Julia's incredibly great calligraphic style, she actually did all of the words in any Warhol drawing from 1951 forward. So any text you see in a Warhol drawing from the 50s is by Julia, and she even signed his name for him. It was really great that they were collaborators, and Julia even won an award from the Art Directors Guild of America for her penmanship, and it was not awarded to Julia Warhola. The award said to Andy Warhol's mother. So I always think that Julia kind of beat Andy to the punch in terms of coming up with the concept of Campbell's soup as an artistic subject matter. But there are a lot of other reasons that Warhol decided to paint soup as well. This is one of the prints that was later made in 1969. But when the Campbell soup cans came out, the paintings in 1962, Andy displayed them at a gallery in Los Angeles, and had them displayed on a thin shelf around the perimeter of the gallery. Again, all 32 flavors. And it was as though an earthquake hit the art world. He became instantaneously famous almost overnight, because the Los Angeles papers picked it up first, and very quickly the New York newspapers picked it up. This young artist from New York had the gumption or the gall or the nerve to paint Campbell's soup cans as though they were fine art. A lot of people thought it was complete blasphemy. It was insanity. Why would this be art? Because thinking about art in the 1950s, we're talking about abstract expressionism. So Jackson Pollock, Mark Rothko, the idea that the painting comes from your soul, that it's a meditative action, and it has nothing to do with reality or physical objects in the world. And for Warhol to paint a physical object, not only from the world, but from our kitchen cabinets, was really a radical gesture. So the great percentage of the art world thought this was complete garbage, whereas a few young curators and young writers thought this was absolutely perfect. This was as American as you could get. And thinking about the financial and economic context of America in the 1950s, after the war, the economy is growing, people are doing well, and everyone is starting to have access to standard commercial products like Campbell's soup or Coca-Cola. So that's why Andy decides to paint these things. And again, one of the beauties of the Warhol Museum is to have many of these treasures, including this phenomenal soup can painting from 1962, where Andy actually rips the label off, showing the can in a state of degradation or a state of decay. Not only the perfect soup can, but also the imperfections. And I think the reason we remember Warhol so much is that he was so perfectly adept at keeping his finger directly on the pulse of American culture, but not just the good side. He was certainly looking at the new economy, the new wealth of America, the access that people had to consumer product, but he was also looking at the dark side. And this soup can painting starts to hint at what lies beneath when you rip the surface away. And this painting does so even more. White Burning Car number 3 from 1963, where Warhol starts his Death and Disasters series, and he's looking at the underbelly of America, collecting photographs of car crashes, suicides, murder scenes, instruments of death and destruction, and turning them into paintings. And this is a really, really difficult painting to look at, but you can see that it's a car crash with smoke coming out of the car, and if you look on the left side of each image, there's a telephone pole with a human body impaled onto the telephone pole hanging there. The man was ejected from the car and then stuck onto the telephone pole. It's an actual photograph from a real accident scene, and it's horrible to look at. But somehow, by enlarging it and making it bigger than life, it's actually, you're able to look at it and not turn away in fear. And for Andy, he realized that for any of us, no matter where we live in the world, we have great things that happen in our lives, and we have absolutely horrific things that happen in our lives as well. So he's looking at America for its wealth and its glamour and its position in the world, but he's also looking at the horrible things that happen in America, like car crashes, like assassinations, murders, and other really horrific things. And I always think the best way to understand Andy Warhol is to imagine that you're reading a gossip magazine where there's celebrity gossip, there's things about how wealthy and fabulous people are, but there are also articles about really horrible natural disasters, accidents, plane crashes, things like that, so that he's really capturing both sides of the American equation. And every once in a while, he would be able to find a subject that could combine both of those topics, wealth and glamour on one side and death and destruction on the other. So his Jackie series, featuring Jackie Kennedy, is definitely a prime example of that. This is an image from the museum with all of the archival materials, the images, the source images that Andy used to paint the Jackie series, with the paintings behind on the wall. They're always shown in a grid, and you can see there are multiple color variations. But the series consists of images of Jackie Kennedy, both before President Kennedy's assassination and after. And Andy would call these photographs from magazines and newspapers to use as his source image, so that it's a before and after story of Camelot, the amazing world of President Kennedy, who stood for so many truly American things. And then, of course, with his assassination, his poor widow Jackie has to deal with the aftermath, and you see images of her with the veil and the white images in the middle at the funeral. So it's a before and after story of one of the most tragic incidents in American history. So just going through a couple of other highlights from the collection at the museum, this amazing double Elvis. Of course, I hinted earlier about Warhol's use of repetition of the same image, and he loved looking at celebrities and their presence. And I've always viewed these Elvis paintings as the idea that when you get this double image, it's almost a blur. It's as though a piece of film is stuck in the projector and it's just flashing the same image again and again. Marilyn Monroe, his most iconic image, and when Andy painted the first Marilyn Monroe paintings, this is a print later from 1967, but Andy started painting Marilyn Monroe within the same week of her dying, and he realized that she would be an icon that would last forever. And again, she was the perfect subject for him because not only was she beautiful and talented and the most famous actress in America, but she was also leading a very tragic life. She was very unlucky at love. There were lots of rumors about her wanting to commit suicide. Her death is still a mystery, whether it was suicide or murder or who knows what it could have been. But she was a very tragic figure, just as she was a very elegant figure. So Warhol realized that for him, she was the absolute perfect subject. And when we look at the next picture of Andy sitting in his silver factory, wearing one of his silver wigs, I always think that in many ways he was trying to relate himself to Marilyn Monroe. Andy started wearing that silver wig in 1962, and it was for a very practical reason. I think you probably all know images of Andy with his hair blown out in 1986 with the big fright wigs, but he started to wear the wig simply because he was going bald and started to get bald spots. And it was rather difficult if he wanted to be known as the hippest, youngest artist in New York who was doing the most important work. You can't really be balding. So he decided to start wearing the wig, and I think in many ways it was his own reference to Marilyn Monroe and her platinum blonde, very famous hair. But I love this photograph because Andy's sitting in the silver factory, and you can tell on the walls and the window that's all aluminum foil and mylar. And the floors and the ceilings were all painted with metallic silver paint. So he created his art studio to make it seem as though it was a factory. And this again links to Pittsburgh, and one of the great joys of having the Warhol Museum in Pittsburgh is to celebrate the industrial past of Pittsburgh, but also the industrial reality of Andy Warhol, who really mimicked his production on the idea of an assembly line. So in 1962, he invented the use of silk screens to make his paintings. So he was doing underpaint by hand, but then would take a photograph, have it burned onto a silk screen, and the very last image that you get is, in this case, all of the black would be pushed through the screen to complete the subject and to complete the painting. He was the first artist to ever use silk screening as a way to make a painting. Before that, it had only been used to make cardboard boxes, posters, things in the commercial world. You see that Andy is sitting on one of his Brillo box sculptures, which were plywood boxes that were then silk screened with the logo of Brillo box, and you see in his hand the squeegee. So in many ways, that was Warhol's paintbrush, because that's the tool that he used to push the black paint through the screen to finalize his production. But it was really so innovative to think about how to mechanically reproduce a painting, and thus that allowed him to make the same image again and again and again. And yet, each one of Warhol's paintings is completely unique, because depending on how much ink or paint you put onto the screen, how much pressure you use in pushing the paint through, each image is completely different and unique. This is a fantastic work from 1964, one of Warhol's most famous, his Flowers painting. And of course, it's interesting to think that Warhol, being an appropriation artist who was borrowing work from mainstream media, cutting things out of newspapers, taking things from Hollywood publicity photos, you would think, at least today in America, copyright law is incredibly intense. So if someone takes someone else's images and uses them, they're oftentimes sued in a court of law for stealing that image. Not so the case in the 1960s, but in fact, Warhol was sued one time in his life for stealing someone's image, and it was this one, which you would think would not be the case. It's the most mundane of images, but the woman who took the original photograph of these flowers happened to publish it in a mainstream photography magazine on the cover, and she copywrote her image. So Andy saw it, liked it, cut it out, blew it up, totally changed the color palette, and made his own flowers paintings. But sadly for him, the photographer saw these paintings, realized it was from her photograph, and sued him. Andy settled out of court, but she did very well. She got 2 flowers paintings, about $10,000 in cash, and 10% of the sale of every flowers painting or print that would come. So she actually worked out quite well. But again, these are the types of stories we share at the Warhol Museum, and are always so great for our visitors to see. This is Warhol's film Empire, 1964. It's a film that is over 8 hours long. In late 1963 into early 64, Andy is already becoming the most talked about young emerging artist in America, and he's being celebrated, and every work that he's making 62, 63 is getting a lot of great critical acclaim. But he decides to try something different. So he says, I'm going to be a filmmaker. So he made his first film called Sleep, which was a film of over 5 hours in length of his friend John Giorno sleeping for 5 hours. He wanted to make the most boring movie ever made and thought that showing someone sleeping would do the trick. However, audiences actually thought, this is interesting. Is he dreaming? Is he comfortable? What's going on? So it was actually a critical success, and people found it really interesting. So in his second film, Andy says, I'll make the most boring film ever made. And he films a static skyscraper for 8 hours and a few minutes, and nothing happens except it goes from daytime to dusk to nighttime. And here in this image is when the lights turn on. That's the biggest action that happens in the film. And it really became a cult classic in New York, and today stands as one of the most important avant-garde films in American cinema, simply because audiences had to challenge each other to try to stay awake for the entire length of the film. And I really don't know if anyone has ever really been able to stay awake for the entire film, but it's really quite exceptional. So again, another thing that we do at the museum is to share all aspects of Warhol and his production. And it's always so interesting to know that not only was he well known and celebrated as a painter and a filmmaker, but Andy just could never stop experimenting and innovating and trying out new things. So in 1969, he started his magazine, Interview magazine, which is still going strong today. This is an image of an issue from 1972 featuring his friend Liza Minnelli, Judy Garland's daughter, on the cover. And it's around this time in 1970, 1971 that Andy really starts to have a very different life. In the 1960s, his factory became a hub of creativity, of strangeness, and if you were a hip, cool artist or musician or an underground character in New York, you would go and hang out at Andy Warhol's factory. That's just what you did. But Andy wasn't yet hanging out with celebrities and with really known famous people or wealthy people. But in many ways, starting Interview magazine, which started off looking at the film industry, Andy realized that he could really approach any celebrity. Celebrities tend to be vain and say, hi, I'm Andy Warhol, I can put you on the cover of my magazine. And of course, celebrities love to be on the cover of a magazine, so they would say yes. And he would then get to know them. He would oftentimes photograph them or sometimes even paint them. And very quickly, he fell into a much higher level of social awareness in terms of entering the international jet set. So all of a sudden, he's hanging out with the richest collectors, the richest celebrities, royalty from around the world. And he realizes, all of a sudden, being around the richest people in the world, that he can turn this into a business model. And this is when he starts his own celebrity portraits, and certainly looking back at those early celebrity photographs I showed you, I think this is where the idea comes from, in addition to art history, where artists have been painting kings and queens and popes for centuries. This is a photograph of Carolina Herrera, the fashion designer, made in 1978. It's a Polaroid photograph, and this is how Andy would take photographs of his subjects and then turn those into paintings. He had a really great business model. You would pay $20,000 for 2 paintings. The first one was $15,000, and then he would give you a deal, $5,000 for the next, and each additional. So if you wanted 4, it would cost $30,000, et cetera, but you had to buy at least 2. Very quickly, the price went up, and all of a sudden they were $25,000 each, then $50,000 each, and then $75,000 each. So by the end of the 1970s, Andy was making about $2 million US a year just from these celebrity portraits. So it was a very smart business move, and he actually used a nightclub, Studio 54, the most famous nightclub in New York City in the late 70s into the early 80s, as his office in a lot of ways, and that this is where he was interacting with these very rich people and celebrities, and would just simply say, oh, I should paint you, and they would say, oh, of course. So it was just like creating his own money, printing money, painting. And he actually did that very thing, painted money. Here, one of his famous dollar sign paintings in the museum collection from 1981, where he paints the dollar sign in a lot of different typographic fonts. When this painting came out in 1981, art critics hated it. They thought it was tacky, gauche, not in style. But when we look back at these paintings today, America in the early 1980s was only about money. It was a crazy capitalist economy. The economy was doing very well. Investment banking was really taking off, and that's sadly what society was about at the time. So looking back, it's a perfect indication of where America was at that specific moment in time. Here you have a beautiful cross painting from the museum's collection. Andy was actually incredibly religious. Of course, the family from Slovakia was Byzantine Catholic, and Andy grew up going to an Orthodox church in Pittsburgh, St. John Chrysostom, from his birth onward, growing up in an environment surrounded by Russian and Eastern European icons, gold images of the Virgin Mary, etc. So when you think about him later painting Marilyn Monroe in gold, I always think in many ways he's painting her as though she's his own Virgin Mary in so many ways. But Andy went to church, and this is something very few people know. He went to church every single day. He had to walk into a church just to say a prayer. And this spirit of faith is something that people don't always think about when you think about Andy Warhol. But his religion was incredibly important to him. This is a phenomenal painting in the collection, a collaboration between Jean-Michel Basquiat, the African-American painter, with Andy. Andy, in this period, in the early to mid-1980s, as I said earlier, had a really horrible critical attention in the art press in America. Writers were saying that he was washed up, he was a has-been, his work wasn't relevant anymore. And realizing this, he decided one way to stay in the game and to continue to be relevant would be to hang out with the young, hip, cool artists. So he very quickly created friendships and ultimately mentorships with the young artists of the day, like Jean-Michel Basquiat and Keith Haring and Julian Schnabel and Francesco Clemente, who were the young stars of the New York art world, and realized that by painting with them and creating collaborative paintings, that he thought he could again be celebrated by the art critics of New York. Sadly, however, when this series of paintings came out in 1985, the reviews were so bad that Jean-Michel Basquiat, who was one of the most famous young artists going, dumped Andy and said, "We can't be friends anymore. You're really bringing my reputation down." And he stopped talking to Andy. Sadly, Andy would die just about a year and a half after that, in February of 1986, and Jean-Michel sadly would die of a drug overdose about a year later. But this last image of Warhol, which is his self-portrait from 1986, is a really, really impactful, beautiful, and strong image, and probably the way we remember Warhol most, as larger than life with his crazy hair, his very penetrating gaze. Andy made these paintings, sadly, just about 6 months before he died for an exhibition in London at Anthony Dauphin Gallery. And he used hairspray to get the wig to stand up extra big. And sadly, this becomes his death mask, the very last self-portrait that he makes, and thus one of the most sought after and most desirable. Andy died from a medical complication of an operation that he had that was for his gallbladder. A very simple operation that normally, under basic circumstances, should have been a very easy operation. However, in 1968, Andy was actually shot by a rather crazed woman named Valerie Solanas, and she was a feminist and a playwright, both great things, but she decided that the world would be a better place without men. So she started her own society, and it was called Scum, S-C-U-M, and scum is like the surface of a pond, like dirty, gross water algae, but it stood for, as an acronym, the Society for Cutting Up Men, S-C-U-M. And she thought the world would be much better without men, and she decided that Andy Warhol was public enemy number one, and that he was somehow controlling her life. She had actually been an actress in one of his early movies, and she gave him a screenplay that she had written, hoping that he would turn it into a film. Sadly, Andy lost the screenplay, and when she came to get it, he said, "Oh, Valerie, I'm sorry, I can't find it." So she went kind of crazy and went and bought a gun and came back the next day and shot Andy at point-blank range, just about 4 feet away. And the bullet went into his stomach and then bounced off of his rib cage and hit every major organ except his heart. And Warhol was clinically dead for several minutes and somehow was miraculously revived. He very easily should have died that day in June of 1968, but somehow came back. And from that point forward, he was heavily scarred and had to wear a support band around his stomach to keep all of his organs in place. So he was never healthy after that. So because of those internal complications from the shooting, the gallbladder surgery ended up being much more serious than anyone ever would have imagined. So dying at the tender age of 58, it was as though one of the great icons of the world had died. And as I was alluding to at the beginning, when the trustees of his estate decided how to promote him and his legacy, Andy's will was very, very basic. He was not expecting to die. So he had a very basic last will and testament that simply said, "I want my money and my art to support artists and art." And that's all it said. So the trustees had to figure out, how do we support art and artists? And they realized that one of the best ways to do that would be to open a Warhol Museum so that young artists could go and see his work and learn from him, and that scholars could write about it and do more research. And that's exactly what they decided to do. And again, having it based in Pittsburgh really ultimately, in so many ways, changed the face of contemporary Pittsburgh. I happen to be from Pittsburgh originally, born and raised, and it was always a very provincial city. It's a small American city of about 310,000 people, about half the size of the population from the 1950s and before. Pittsburgh lost half of its population between the 1960s and the 1980s, when all of that industry that built America died and went away. So all of a sudden there were no jobs, people were leaving in huge numbers, and the city was really bleak. It was very economically depressed, not a lot going on in terms of culture outside of the big things like opera and ballet. Luckily for Pittsburgh, many of those huge industrial families, like the Mellons from Mellon Bank, the Heinz family from Heinz Ketchup, the Frick family left their fortunes behind for estates and foundations based in Pittsburgh, of which money would support things in Pittsburgh. But in terms of contemporary art, there's the Carnegie Art Museum, and soon after the Mattress Factory Museum of Contemporary Art, and now the Warhol Museum, having opened in 1994. But I can safely tell you that in 1994, when the Warhol Museum opened, it was as though a strange, weird spaceship from New York crash-landed in the middle of Pittsburgh, because Andy, of course, was known as being eccentric and strange and gay and all of the many things that he was, that Pittsburgh maybe wasn't quite ready for. However, over the years and all of the amazing programs that my predecessors and me and the staff over the years at the Warhol Museum have put on, really celebrating diversity, making sure that Andy's work is accessible to absolutely everyone, not dependent at all on your economic status or your sexual orientation or your physical ability or disability. It's a place that welcomes everyone and does a lot of programming to make sure that's put forward. Pittsburgh has become a very different place. It's much more liberal, it's very open-minded today, and I think the Warhol Museum has a lot to do with that. Especially being from there, you sense the change that happened over the 20+ years that the museum has been in existence. I always think that it's very telling when a taxi driver, I think taxi drivers are pretty much the same everywhere in the world. They sort of tell you what you might want to do when you're visiting a city, but those of us that are art people might not really want to do that. But today in Pittsburgh, no matter what taxi you get into, the first thing the taxi driver usually says is, "Are you from here?" "No." "You have to go to see the Warhol Museum. That's the best thing here for you to see." And it happens almost across the board. So it's always good when taxi drivers recommend something like a contemporary art museum that's a little weird, then you know it had some impact. But we always based our work at the museum on a very simple premise, and that premise was that Andy Warhol in so many ways was a complete anomaly to society. Nothing that he did made sense, nothing that he became made sense because of where he came from. Being poor, he was sickly as a child, he had a strange neurological condition that kept him away from school for 2 years when he was a young boy. He was gay, living in the closet. Nothing about him made any sense, but he overcame all of those obstacles to become this incredibly world-famous individual. And that's how we based all of our education programs, starting there, to tell anyone that you too, if you work hard and you're dedicated and you have a skill that you love and you're passionate about, you too can go on and really succeed in life. And we realized that through his work and through everything that he did, he gave voice to so many different aspects of society, allowing subaltern identities, the people that populated his factory in the 1960s, whether they be African Americans or Latino Americans, drag queens, people that were not mainstream society. He celebrated them and he made them stand out on their own and in many ways tried to make them celebrities and thus gave them voice or agency. And that's exactly what we tried to do at the museum as well, to make sure that our visitors had agency and that we were showing other contemporary artists who other museums might not show. A lot of American museums can tend to be very conservative and not want to address topics that might be viewed as somewhat rebellious or against the status quo. Of course, America has a reputation for being a place of like freedom and whatever you want to do, you can do, but in reality, a lot of museums don't want to work with artists who are challenging or trying to change the situation. But that's what we did first and foremost at the Warhol Museum. And again, I think that that was incredibly helpful for making Pittsburgh a cool, hip place. So I'm going to end there. And I think we can take questions from the audience. And I have a lovely assistant who will hand over the mic should you happen to have any questions. Please feel free to ask anything you so desire. And don't be shy.
Да, Дим, вы видишь меня. Я хотела бы спросить первое, потому что мы с Эриком говорили о том, что и вчера у нас была дискуссия по поводу того, как музей изменяет.
On how a museum changes the city, and Eric told us about what the facade of the museum looks like, about the music that enters out into the streets, and the question that I have, pop art, not just in Pittsburgh, but like a global phenomenon. We just talked with Eric that Eric was the curator of the Armory show this year, together with, well, using his approach. Could you give us a bit more detail about how Warhol perhaps had an impact on what pop art looks like now, using Armory show perhaps as an example?
Well, certainly Warhol is known for his pop aesthetic, and as you said, last night we talked about the physical structure of the museum. It's in a beautiful old 1911 warehouse building, very classic facade, a beautiful old building. Of course, Moscow is filled with beautiful classical architecture. I wanted to flip that on its head and make it scream pop. So I started playing disco music on the sidewalk and put Warhol's cow wallpaper in the windows so that as you approach the building, you hear pop music and you see pop imagery to make it a true temple to Andy Warhol. But, you know, in terms of my own development as a curator and ultimately a museum director and now working in the art business side of things, which again is very Warholian in so many ways because Andy really saw no division between art and business. I alluded to that so many times that he was doing so well financially that he really did view the making of his works as the printing of money, because it was a cash exchange, and he was doing incredibly well commercially in his lifetime as an artist, which is very rare. Many artists don't do really well in their lifetime. They struggle constantly just to get by, and those of you that are artists here fully understand that, but you have to struggle and make art because that's what you do as an artist. You have no choice, you have to. But he saw commercial success in his life, and again, was constantly innovating and constantly thinking about how to take objects from mainstream culture and reinvent them and represent them as pop iconographic imagery. So in terms of thinking about my own curatorial practice and my own art history, having, I should say that I was an intern at the Warhol Museum when we opened in 1994. I just graduated from college, and I was the first intern in the curatorial department and worked there for an entire year, researching Warhol, absorbing Warhol, and learning all about him. So of course, it was very influential on my future path. Ultimately, I did a little bit of a curveball and moved to Japan. I studied Japanese art history as an undergraduate in college, and then decided to go back to Japan for graduate school. But I decided to look at post-war Japanese art, very much based on a pop aesthetic. So that's how I had my sort of academic underpinnings between Warhol and between Japan, bouncing back and forth, and then started to broaden looking at global contemporary art. I was a curator on the first Yokohama Triennale in Japan in 2001 that brought 106 artists from all over the world to Japan. But I've always thought about accessibility at the end of the day, like Andy, and how do you present works of art to everyone so that everyone, no matter if you're a PhD art history intellectual through to someone that has no history in art or no background in art, how you can walk in and still have a meaningful relationship or experience because of the artwork put in front of you. So in doing the Armory show, for example, which is a huge commercial art fair in New York, happens every March, with hundreds of galleries coming from all over the world, I wanted to think about how I could use art to somehow interrupt the space of an art fair. I went to Kosmoskau here 2 days ago, the art fair here, which was really lovely and elegant and wide alleyways to walk down, and it was actually very pleasant. But the Armory show, you know you've been, has just hundreds of galleries in these huge long rows, so it becomes very monotonous. And I wanted to figure out how I could use pop, bright imagery to break up that monotony. So I put a huge Kusama Yayoi sculpture right in the middle and created a garden with several of her polka dot sculptures around the space, just so that people could have moments of joy, reflection, thought, so that you could pause looking at a beautiful object and then go on to the rest of the booths and the rest of the artwork, because it can just get completely overwhelming. So Warhol has certainly been a huge influence in my own thinking about how art can be both accessible and how it can make you take pause and actually have meaning in your life. And I think anyone in the art world should start with those very basic assumptions and then build on it from there.
Thank you. Да, вот там вопрос.
Oh,
Задавайте по-русски, пожалуйста.
please ask your questions in Russian. There will be translation. Thank you so much for your presentation. What impact did your museum experience have on what you're doing now at Sotheby's?
Well, it has a lot of impact, actually, and I'm always a very honest person, and I feel that I don't have to have any secrets when I talk publicly. But certainly making the transition from being a museum director, going to the commercial side of the art world, some people tend to think that you have sold out or that you've gone to the dark side, because that's the joke of the art world, that the commercial side is somehow the dark side. But I always say that the Warhol Museum especially trained me for what I do today, because again, Andy was only looking at his entire body of production as a double-sided coin between art and business. And he was not apologetic about being successful. He was not apologetic about making money. And I have a very common core belief that artists should be financially rewarded for the work that they do. And it is work, it is a profession, and we've all heard the concept of the starving artist who dedicates his or her life to the making of artwork in the face of poverty and complete odds against the person to make sure that their aesthetic vision is delivered out to the world. It's a romantic notion, but it's not practical. And I really think that any artist should be rewarded probably more than anyone else in society. I think teachers and artists should be the ones that get the biggest salaries, because they're the ones that are making the most impact, both in terms of education and then appreciation and enjoyment of the visual world around us. So Sotheby's right now, of course, historically is an auction house, and we sell artwork on the secondary market that collectors have owned for many years who decide to sell for whatever reason. Death and divorce and debt are the three big reasons people decide to sell. But it's an inevitability that people do sell artwork and that people buy artwork, and this has been happening for centuries. But it's a really fun time for me to be there, especially because right now we're completely reinventing the company, and we don't even call ourselves an auction house anymore. We call ourselves an art business, and we're looking at all aspects of that. And not only are we selling things from private collections on the secondary market, but we're also now working directly with artists and representing artist estates, helping living artists to plan for their future, plan for their estates, plan for foundations, giving them shows while they're still alive, and hopefully getting even more money directly to artists in that sense. But we're also looking at how artist foundations in the future will have power to come together to, like Warhol when he left his money to support art and artists. And I should say that today the Warhol Foundation, which is the charitable branch of that estate, is now worth about $350 million US and gives $15 million away every year to support museum exhibitions all over America. So Andy actually got his wish of supporting art and artists financially as well, but it was because of his success in his lifetime. So we're thinking, how can we work with artists to make an even bigger impact, a bigger foundation to support museums and artists in their lifetime, which is certainly the main reason. And I remind everyone of this: the art market would not exist if it were not for artists. And we have to remember that always, So how do we support them in their lifetime, and how do we make sure that their work gives back as well into the future? So that's been a really great experience for me, being at Sotheby's now for a year, and thinking about where we can go with that. And certainly having spent so much of my career with Warhol and his legacy, a lot of that has been very instrumental in my thinking about where we go as a business in the future.
Thank you. И там вот вопрос, да.
Another question? Thank you so much for your lecture. You talked about Pittsburgh, that it was an industrial town, and after the museum opened, is it still industrial, or is that all sort of set aside now? Now everything is focused around the museum, like in Spain, when you go to the Dalí Museum, everything around, the restaurants are named after Dalí, all the shops are branding Dalí. Did this had an impact on the town, the opening of the museum?
Thank you, that's a great question. There is one bar in Pittsburgh called the Brillo Box, but only one. So there is that. But Pittsburgh is a totally changed environment today, and it's very rare for an industrial city in America that went down. We call them Rust Belt cities for the rust of the degrading industrial complex. So cities like Detroit, Buffalo, Cleveland, many of them are struggling, and Detroit is in a huge economic crisis and doing really poorly right now, sadly, whereas Pittsburgh is really thriving, and it's not based on industry. There's literally one steel mill still remaining in Pittsburgh, just one from dozens and dozens and dozens in the past. But today's Pittsburgh, the economy is based purely on technology. So Carnegie Mellon University, being one of the great tech schools, is a spin-off or an incubator for so many new companies because they have the best in software engineering, robotics, all sorts of new technologies. And a lot of the major tech companies realized that so many of their employees were coming out of Carnegie Mellon that instead of hiring those kids to move to San Francisco, to the Valley where the hub of technology exists in America, they would actually move their operations or start operations in Pittsburgh. So today Google has a huge office in Pittsburgh, Uber has a huge office focusing on self-driving cars based in Pittsburgh. So there are technology companies that are just starting constantly. Duolingo, many of you might know, which is a language training application, is based in Pittsburgh and started out of a workshop at Carnegie Mellon University. So it's really becoming economically vibrant again with so many of these technology companies there. And I also like to think that the Warhol Museum and all of the other cultural attractions there have a lot to do with that because, of course, the university provides the academic rigor and the basis for those companies to come out. However, the museums and especially the Warhol really add to the quality of life in Pittsburgh and just make it a cool, hip, relevant place. So when you say the Andy Warhol Museum is in Pittsburgh, young tech kids say, oh, I want to go move there. So it's sort of like Austin or Portland, which are the other two hip American cities. I can safely say that Pittsburgh has now achieved that same status as a cool place to live. And again, having come from there myself and having escaped once for 11 years before I went back to the Warhol Museum, I never thought that I would ever say that Pittsburgh is a hip city, but it is decidedly a hip city today.
Thank you. Eric, thank you very much. Друзья, спасибо
Sure.
вам большое. Эрик дальше поедет.
Eric is going on to look at Moscow. We are hoping to send him to the People's Fair, Vdnh. At 4 o'clock, we'll be coming back here with a lecture from Diane, the curator of the educational program at the Contemporary San Paulo Museum, and she's going to talk about how they work with volunteers, kids from households. She's here with us. Thank you so much, Eric. Thank you, everyone.